Welcome to this installment of Brave New World on ContextTV. Today we're going to basically dissect Chamath Palihapitiya's comments on CNBC that, hey, if these companies get in trouble, the government should not bail them out and, in fact, let them die because what's the point of saving these billionaire hedge fund owners' states? Then I want to also touch on the counterpoint by Josh Brown, the reform broker, that basically said, look, let's not make things any worse. So Chamath is a Sri Lankan-born Canadian-American, and he spent some time at AOL after the dot-com bubble burst. But really, he was fortunate and lucky and I guess smart to be at the right place at the right time. You got to create your own luck by joining Facebook early on. And that's basically where he made his billions. And then he launched Social Capital, which is an investment fund that basically manages his own money. And, on a much smaller scale, kind of like me not having outside investors, I can say and do certain things that may ruffle some feathers. And that's basically what Chamath did when he went on CNBC. And I don't know if he was planning to say that. It definitely made great headlines, but it's a natural reaction, right? Why is it that such a small sliver of the bailout is going to individual consumers and citizens, and so much of it, at least seemingly, is helping the fat cat, so to speak. Now, by the way, a little side note, so Chamath is chairman of Virgin Galactica, related to Virgin, and Virgin co-founder Richard Branson is currently asking the UK government for, you guessed it, a bailout. And what is pissing off UK citizens is like he wants that money to basically just pay for the fixed costs of maintaining his airplanes and not actually the employees, allegedly, which obviously doesn't sit well with British citizens. And I'd love to be a fly on the wall next time those two gentlemen chat after Sir Branson, saw Chamath's interview on CNBC. Now, look, capitalism has served Chamath really, really well. So I wanted to kind of test that notion that he says that employees of these companies that would get the bailouts own tiny shares. Because I think you do need to be kind of aware of yourself. When I produced Fox in the Hen House last year, pointing out that, a lot of young voters are drawn to socialism and billionaires are calling out capitalism's inequality, I kind of looked at it through what is the role of that entrepreneurship can play, but noting that obviously, I couldn't be a hypocrite because as much as there's some parts of socialism that I find make sense, capitalism has served me well, right? So I don't think, when you go out there and you talk about a system not working, you can't lack the awareness, well, said system has made you a billionaire in Chamath's case. In any case, when I started my studies in finance in the late 90s, it was concurrent to what was happening in long-term capital management, where a former Salomon trader named John Merriweather basically thought he was taking these risk-less arbitrage positions, and there is no such thing, whereas in fact he was taking on massive amounts of risk. And ultimately a hedge fund, you figure if it goes down, hey, too bad for you. But Goldman Sachs and a consortium of bankers, and I think Warren Buffett and many people basically felt that to preserve the economy, they had to step in and rescue it. Bear Stearns did not do that, by the way. A decade later, the mortgage market, where they were securitizing, bundling all these crappy, low-quality mortgages and passing them off as high-grade investments, that imploded, obviously. And again, the U.S. government felt that it was necessary to step in and preserve Lehman, but they let Bear Stearns die, and one of the reasons was, I think, partly because Bear Stearns did not step in the late 90s, in any case. But ultimately, there was a bailout of the banks because they were afraid of the trickle-down effects, the domino effect. And again, you're talking about even Republicans whose idol, Ronald Reagan, talked about trickle-down economy and trickle-down effect. So obviously the thinking is always that, hey, if you help people at the top, that will trickle down to the bottom of the economy. So in bad times, the thinking philosophically, to be consistent, is, well, if you let somebody at the top basically lose everything, there will be trickle-down effects. Agree or disagree, I'm just saying that's how these people think. Now, in the reform broker Josh Brown's Let's Not Make Things Worse article, he does basically provide a fascinating counterpoint, which did not grab as many headlines as Chamath's outburst on CNBC, which was highly entertaining. So I just wanted to highlight some of that and not just pontificate based on opinion only, although we'll finish on with my thoughts as well. So first of all, when it comes to retirement assets, you're looking at $35 trillion of retirement assets. That represents 52% of all households, 65 million in all, and they own about stocks, and that represents 28% of their total financial assets. It's not an immaterial sum. And that's basically 37% of the entire US market, meaning stocks are crucial for households. When it comes to individual households, again, 44% of them own some kind of mutual fund. In fact, 56 million households, representing 100 million people, own 89% of mutual funds. Again, that's a massive number. Now, you could argue hedge funds are too smart to own mutual funds, but that's another point. Now, pensions, so think you work at a hospital, you work in food services, you're a policeman, a firefighter, a paramedic. Through your pension, you own 44% of mutual funds through your pension, which is, again, nothing to sneeze at. You could argue that, hey, if the rest include billionaire hedge fund, fat cats, that's one thing, but 44%, isn't immaterial. And I think Josh makes a good point to say, quote, imagine them trying to do the heroic things that they're doing each day while also watching their retirement assets drop by another 30% in value, end quote. The man makes a point. Now, what about individual investors and employees who work at companies and through employment stock option plans, or ESOPs, own a share of the company they work for? That represents, granted, before 17 million people lost their jobs, and actually 22 million people lost their jobs. That represents 16 million people, and the value is 1.3 trillion. And again, 20% of people who work in the private sector own stocks, and that's about 32 million people. So look, the bottom line, 32 million people, because that includes 401ks and other means, not just ESOPs. ESOPs is 16 million. So I loved Chamath's take. It was a hot take. It's a passionate point, and I think he makes a lot of sense. But it's like, we can't expect to solve the problems that we're having by taking an extreme position and not seeing that there needs to be a bit of a balance, right? If you think about it, Chamath's impassioned point is valid, and Josh Brown's stats are also fair and valid and correct. And I think there's a middle ground that you need to adopt. And I think, my thoughts on this are, there's an analogy between just the stock market and the bailout. So either the stock market only benefits the rich, which is not true. The stock market, in theory, benefits everybody. Ergo, the bailout may disproportionately help the billionaire who is an owner of a material stake in a business, for sure. But you can't argue that it won't benefit all of these people that own the stock in those companies as well. If you wipe out the equity holders because debt trumps equity, well, you're going to wipe out the rich and the poor. And the reality is, if a billionaire loses, tens of millions, even hundreds of millions of dollars, he's going to be fine. But I agree that if a guy who doesn't have the same net worth loses 20, 30% of their portfolio, of their assets that is represented by equity, well, that person's going to feel the brunt a lot more. Ultimately, I think you just need to recognize that, at this moment, you don't necessarily want things to get worse. What I would like to see if the government bails out any of these companies is that, maybe you don't need to totally wipe out some of the equity holders, but definitely I think you need the government then to also benefit when these companies turn around and when these companies eventually rebound and the economy rebounds. And I'd like to see the government actually, I know that might scare some people and think, well, isn't that socialism? But you're already seeing a lot of things and aspects of socialism with what the government is doing, because, like it or not, COVID is doing what no politician and no election ever could, and that's basically shift America to the left.